The words came from the far side of the rotunda, and they carried the way a dropped tray carries, so that 400 people in evening dress heard them at once and pretended they had not. The Halloran Pavilion in Kingsbridge, Massachusetts, had been built in 1904 as a sail loft and converted 80 years later into a private museum with a marble floor and a ceiling of riveted iron trusses, and on this particular Friday in October it held every serious horology collector on the eastern seaboard, 200 donors, a string quartet nobody was listening to, and one old man in a charcoal wool vest who had been standing very still in front of a vitrine for 11 minutes. Anselmo Trigo did not turn around, because Anselmo Trigo had not heard a human voice since he was 4 years old. What he had been looking at was the clock. It stood 7 feet tall inside a case of argon-filled glass, walnut and gilt bronze and blued steel, a tower of wheels and dials and small painted figures, and at the top a celestial globe the size of a grapefruit, turning with the patience of something that had been keeping time since before the Mayflower. The placard called it the Vehlin astronomical clock, Augsburg 1618, on loan from the Ostrander collection, insured at $40 million. Trigo had read the placard once. Then he had spent the rest of his 11 minutes watching the escapement through the gap in the back plate, and his mouth had gone dry, and one of his enormous steady hands had begun to tremble very slightly, which in 71 years had happened perhaps 6 times. A hand closed on his elbow. He looked up into the face of a young man in a headset who was saying something with too many teeth in it, and behind that young man came Garrick Ostrander, crossing his own rotunda with a glass of something amber held away from his lapel. "There's no touching," Ostrander said, and tapped the vitrine glass with a knuckle. "Do you understand me?" "No." Trigo watched the mouth. He got about half of it. He raised both hands, palms out, the universal gesture, and then he reached slowly into his vest for the small notebook and the pencil stub he had carried since 1968. "Oh, for God's sake," said Ostrander. Laughter came off the marble in a way Trigo could not hear, but could absolutely feel, the way you feel a truck go by. He wrote anyway. His handwriting was small and square and beautiful, the handwriting of a man who has spent his life labeling parts no bigger than a poppy seed. He turned the notebook around. It said, "The mainspring is fully wound and the stack-freed cam is loaded wrong. Do not let anyone move this clock in that condition." Ostrander read it. His pale grey eyes went over it twice, and something crossed his face that was not embarrassment, but its cousin, the irritation of a man who has been handed a problem by someone he has already decided is beneath having problems. Trigo held up the invitation. It was creased in 4 places from his coat pocket. It had his name printed on it, and a line beneath his name that said, "Guest of the Kingsbridge Historical Society," and Ostrander looked at that line the way a customs officer looks at a passport from a country he has never heard of. "Historical Society," Ostrander said. "Right." Trigo did not answer, partly because he had not caught all of it, and partly because it was true. "Let me explain something to you," said Ostrander, and now he was speaking louder, which is what people did, always, forever, as though volume were a ramp. "This is a Vehlin. There are 2 in the world. There are 4 people alive qualified to open the back of that case, and 3 of them are in Switzerland, and the 4th one charges more per day than you make in a year. So when you hand me a note about my clock, what you are actually doing is embarrassing yourself in front of people whose good opinion you will never have." The young man in the headset was looking at his own shoes. Somewhere off to the left, a woman in a grey suit had stopped writing in a reporter's notebook and started paying an entirely different kind of attention. "Devon," Ostrander said, "walk him out." They walked him out, not roughly. That was almost the worst of it, how gently the young man's hand rested on his shoulder blade, the courtesy you extend to something that is being removed rather than someone who is leaving. Trigo went past the coat check and the catering carts and out through a steel door into an alley that smelled of low tide and cigarette smoke, and stood there under a sodium light with his invitation still in his hand. Then he put the invitation in his pocket, and he put the notebook in his vest, and he walked 11 blocks home, because he could not hear a single thing that had been said about him, and he had understood all of it. To understand what Ostrander had actually done that night, you have to go back 67 years to a second-floor apartment above a fish market on Water Street and a woman named Ilda Trigo. Anselmo lost his hearing in 1959 at 4 to bacterial meningitis that came on a Tuesday and was finished with him by Friday. He woke up in a world that had gone to felt. His mother wept in doorways for a year. His father, who worked the scallop boats out of New Bedford, stopped talking to him almost entirely, not out of cruelty, but out of a total failure of imagination. The man simply had no idea what a person was supposed to do with a son who could not be shouted at. His grandmother had ideas. Ilda Trigo had come over from Terceira in 1931 with 2 dresses and a set of steel gravers wrapped in oilcloth. In the Azores, her father had kept the chronometers for a whaling fleet, and she had learned at his elbow the way girls learned things then, unofficially and completely. In Kingsbridge, she ran a shop the size of a closet on the ground floor of the fish market building, and for 30 years every scallop captain between Point Judith and Provincetown brought her their marine chronometers because Ilda Trigo's rates on a full service were reasonable and her work was better than Boston's. She put her deaf grandson on a stool at her bench when he was 5.5. She did not have a signed language, not at first. What she had was her hands and a piece of slate and an absolute refusal to be inconvenienced. She would set a movement in front of him, take his index finger and press it against the plate so he could feel the tick coming up through the brass into the pad of his fingertip. Then she would sign, in the rough home language the two of them built between them over 11 years, the thing she said so often that it became less a sentence than a floor to stand on. As mãos ouvem o que os ouvidos perdem, the hands hear what the ears lose. She meant it technically before she ever meant it any other way. A watchmaker who listens to a movement, she told him, hears an average of the noise. A watchmaker who feels a movement gets the truth, unaveraged, because vibration does not flatter. By the time Anselmo was 9, he could tell a worn pallet from a bent pivot by touch alone. By 11, he could feel a chronometer running 8 seconds fast a day, which no hearing apprentice in the state could do. By 14, he was cutting his own pinions on her treadle lathe and stamping the finished work with the mark she gave him, a tiny anchor with the letters A.T. beneath it, because she said a man should be willing to sign what he made. Ilda died in 1976, in March, on a Sunday afternoon, sitting up in her chair with a half-serviced deck watch in her lap. Anselmo was 21. He kept the shop. He also kept getting better, in the particular silent way that people get better when nobody is watching and nothing is being posted anywhere. He learned English orthography well enough to read technical German with a dictionary. He read every horological monograph the interlibrary loan system in southeastern Massachusetts could produce. And when he ran out of those, he wrote letters, in that small square handwriting, to museums and monasteries and dead men's widows. Which is how, in the spring of 1979, at 24 years old, Anselmo Trigo received an answer from the Convento de São Gonçalo on the island of Terceira in the Azores, 30 miles from where his grandmother was born, regarding a large and broken astronomical clock in their chapter house that no one on the island had been able to run since 1938. It was a Vehlin. There were 2 in the world. That part, at least, Garrick Ostrander had gotten right. Jost Vehlin worked in Augsburg between 1602 and 1631, and he built, so far as anyone can document, 4 great astronomical clocks. 2 burned. The third went to a Bavarian abbey, and from there, by a route involving a shipwreck and a Portuguese wine merchant, to a monastery on Terceira. The 4th surfaced at auction in Geneva in 1998 and sold to an American shipping fortune for $11 million. and by 2026 that same clock was standing under argon glass in the Halloran Pavilion with a $40 million rider on it. Vehlin's clocks were strange even for their century. He did not use the verge and foliot everyone else used. He used a crossbeat escapement, two counter-swinging arms geared to each other, an idea borrowed from Jost Bürgi and executed with a violence of precision that nobody repeated. He drove the going train off a fusee, and he regulated the mainspring's opening turns with a stack-freed, a spring-loaded cam that fights the barrel hardest when the barrel is strongest. It is a device that no clockmaker has fitted new since roughly 1650, because it was superseded, and because getting the cam profile wrong does not simply spoil the rate. It loads the train wrong. Under load over decades, it works iron the way a man works a paperclip back and forth. Anselmo Trigo spent from June of 1979 to November of 1981 in a cold stone room in Terceira, taking one apart. He had no drawings. Nobody has Vehlin's drawings. What he had was a rented room, a stipend of 40 escudos a day, a treadle lathe he built himself from a sewing machine base, and his grandmother's gravers. He worked with a slate at his elbow so the monks could write to him. He learned to sleep through bells he could not hear, and because he could not hear the clock, he did something no hearing restorer had thought to do. He cut a 9-inch rod of brass, filed one end flat, and used it as a stethoscope in reverse. He would set the flat end against the clock's back plate and press the other end to his cheekbone, just forward of the ear, and the whole movement would come up through the bone of his skull into a place behind his eyes. Every tick, every scrape, every hesitation, every one of the two crossbeat arms arriving a hair apart. Bone does not average, bone tells you the truth, unaveraged, which is what Ilda had been saying at a bench above a fish market 20 years earlier to a 5-year-old who could not yet spell it. He documented everything. 6 notebooks eventually filled edge to edge in that small square hand, tooth counts for all 19 wheels, pinion leaf counts, arbor diameters to the half-thousandth, the depthing of the crossbeat gearing, the exact hardness he drew the replacement steel to, the alloy of the 2 new crossbeat arms he cut by hand in the winter of 1980 after the originals were found cracked through at the boss. He took wax squeezes of the stack-freed cam before he touched it, 4 of them, and pressed them into a tin of dental plaster so the profile would exist somewhere outside of one 400-year-old piece of hardened iron. And on the 22nd of November, 1981, before he closed the case, he did the thing his grandmother taught him. He engraved a small brass witness plate and screwed it to the inside of the back door where no visitor would ever see it. An anchor, the letters AT, and a date. The clock in Terceira has run continuously ever since. Nobody in America noticed. There was no press release. The monastery sent a letter of thanks and a crate of cheese. Trigo came home to Kingsbridge, reopened his grandmother's shop on Water Street, and spent the next 45 years servicing wall clocks, pocket watches, bracket clocks, 3 courthouse turret movements, and the tower clock over the old library, for which the town paid him $800 a year and a parking spot. Twice a week he did something else. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, he crossed the parking lot behind the fish market to a room in the Kingsbridge Community Annex, where between 4 and 9 deaf and hard-of-hearing teenagers sat at 8 second-hand benches and learned to hold a screwdriver at 90 degrees. He had run that room since 1994. He had never charged for it. 22 of his students had gone on to jobs at the bench, 2 of them in Geneva, 1 at the Smithsonian. The woman who found him the benches and the tools and eventually the funding was Odalise Fenn. Fenn was 33, an objects conservator at the Halloran Pavilion with a graduate certificate in horological conservation and a mother who was deaf, which meant she had been interpreting since she was 6 years old and had opinions about the ethics of it. She had walked into the annex in 2019 looking for someone to teach her how to bush a worn pivot hole, and she had come out 2 hours later understanding that the old man on Water Street knew things that were not in any book she owned. It was Fen who came to the shop the Monday after the gala. She let herself in past the bell, which Trigo had wired to a lamp, and she found him at the bench with a Waltham deck watch opened up in front of him, and his shoulders in a shape she did not like. "I heard," she signed. "The whole building heard." Trigo shrugged one shoulder. She sat down on the customer stool and pulled her knees up. "I went there to see it," he signed. Then his hands slowed, the way they did when the thing he was saying mattered. "Odorless. The mainspring is wound, all the way. It has been wound and standing for at least a year, and the stack-freed spring is bearing on the low side of the cam. I could see the cam through the back gap. It's not the original profile." Fen's face changed. "Wrong, so that the great wheel arbor takes the load, not the cam." He tapped his own knuckle twice, hard on the bench. 400 years of hand-forged iron, and they have it fighting a spring it was never meant to fight. Every day it sits like that, it works. Maybe 5 years. His hands dropped. "It cannot be moved wound. Nothing can be moved wound. If they move it wound, and they hoist it wrong, and it lets go inside the case." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Fen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, out loud and in sign at once, "Write it down, all of it." He wrote it down. 4 pages, in that small square hand, with a diagram of the stack-freed geometry that a Swiss-trained specialist would later describe, under oath and without apparent pleasure, as the single most useful document produced about the Vehlin clock in 150 years. Fen hand-delivered it on the Wednesday. It reached Ostrander's desk on the Thursday. On the Friday, the Ostrander Family Foundation notified the Kingsbridge Community Annex that its facilities grant would not be renewed. The letter ran 9 lines. It thanked the annex for its stewardship and cited a strategic realignment of the Foundation's education portfolio toward measurable outcomes. It was signed by a director of programs whose name nobody at the annex recognized. The grant was $22,000 a year. It paid the heat, the liability rider, and the lease on the room that Trigo's students used on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The annex's director, a tired good woman named Rosalind Bracey, drove to Water Street and told him herself, writing on the back of the letter because her signing was limited to the alphabet and the word sorry, which she used 4 times. Trigo read it twice. Then he did something Bracey did not expect. He turned the letter over, smoothed it flat, and wrote a single line on the blank side and turned it around. "Did anyone ask you why?" Bracey nodded slowly. "I called." The program director said. She stopped and made herself finish it, writing this part rather than saying it, because it was easier to write. She said the foundation was reviewing relationships with individuals who had created a disturbance at a donor event. He read that. He folded the letter into quarters along creases he made with his thumbnail and put it in his vest pocket next to the invitation. It got worse 8 days later, and this time it was Fen who found it, and she was so angry when she came up the stairs that she forgot to switch on the lamp that told him the door had opened. She dropped a glossy book on the bench, the Ostrander collection, Instruments of Heaven and Hour, printed for the exhibition, 400 pages, £12. She flipped it open to a page she had already marked with her thumb. The Vehlin's provenance essay ran 11 pages. The 1979 to 1981 restoration of the sister clock at São Gonçalo was discussed across 2 of them, because you cannot write about one Vehlin without the other. Trigo read it. Read it again. His face did not do very much. "They took your name out," Fen said. "Anselmo, your name is in the monastery's own record. It's in the 1982 bulletin of the Portuguese Horological Society. I found it in 20 minutes. They didn't fail to find you." Trigo closed the book. He set one broad hand flat on the cover for a moment, the way you'd steady a boat. Then he signed, and Fen watched him say the thing his grandmother had said above a fish market 70 years ago, and she understood that he was not quoting it for comfort. He tapped the book cover twice. "My name isn't in there. My steel is in there. They can print whatever they want." "No," he agreed. The pavilion announced the relocation on the second Tuesday in November. Ostrander was opening a purpose-built wing on his property in Marblehead, a climate-controlled gallery with a glass roof and his mother's name over the door, and the Vehlin was going to be the centerpiece, and the move was scheduled for the first week of December so that the photographs could run before Christmas. There was a press preview. Fen got Trigo through the door as her guest, which she had every right to do, and which cost her more later than she ever told him. 40 people sat in folding chairs in the rotunda, with the vitrine behind Ostrander like an altarpiece. 2 television crews, a woman in a grey suit in the second row with a reporter's notebook, the same woman who had stopped writing at the gala, whose byline in the Kingsbridge ledger read Naomi Okafor. Ostrander talked for 19 minutes about legacy. Then he took questions. Trigo stood up. You could feel the room recalibrate. Fen stood with him, half a step to his left, and when he began to sign, she began to speak, flat and clear and without decoration, because that was the whole discipline of it. "My name is Anselmo Trigo. I am a watchmaker on Water Street. In November, I sent a written technical report to this institution." Ostrander's jaw set. "Sure. The Vehlin's mainspring is standing fully wound. The stack-freed cam is a modern replacement, and its profile is wrong. That means the strain is being carried by the great wheel arbor, which is original hand-forged iron. If you move that clock wound with a rigging point above the case as your own published plan shows, and that arbor fails in transit, the mainspring will discharge into the train. You will lose the crossbeat, the going train, and the globe drive in about 4 seconds, and the crossbeat arms cannot be bought." Fen's voice stopped. The room was extremely quiet. Ostrander laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, which is what made it so much worse. It was the easy laugh of a man performing patience for an audience. "Okay." He turned to the crews, opening his hands. "I want everybody to understand what's happening, because it's actually kind of wonderful. This is a hobbyist. He fixes the clock over the library." He looked back at Trigo, and he said it slowly and much too loudly, the way people always did. "Sir, I'm going to be kind. Go home, fix something with a cuckoo in it. You cannot hear my clock. You have never touched my clock." Somebody in the third row laughed. Naomi Okafor did not laugh. She was writing very fast. "Devon," said Ostrander. "They put Trigo out through the same steel door into the same alley, and on the following Monday a courier delivered a letter to Water Street on the letterhead of a Boston firm, informing Mr. A. Trigo that he was barred from the premises of the Halloran Pavilion and any property of the Ostrander collection, and that further unsolicited communications regarding the collection would be treated as harassment. Trigo put that letter in the vest pocket too. The pocket was getting full. They moved the clock on the 4th of December in a 53-foot air ride trailer, wound. The rigging crew was competent and insured and had moved a Calder. The clock travelled in its case on a spring-isolated pallet, and the road to Marblehead was clean, and nothing happened on the road at all. It happened in the receiving bay at 10:40 in the morning, when the pallet was lifted 11 inches to clear a threshold plate and set down again, and a 400-year-old iron arbor that had been under the wrong kind of load for 11 years decided that it was finished. Nobody heard the arbor go. What they heard, all 6 of them, was what came after, the mainspring letting down all at once into a train that had nothing to hold it, 19 wheels turning at a speed they were never built to turn, a sound one rigger later described as a filing cabinet full of silverware falling down a staircase, and then, after 4 seconds, absolutely nothing. The celestial globe stopped with Orion halfway up. Inside the case, the damage inventory took 9 days to write, Both crossbeat arms had snapped at the boss. The great wheel arbor had sheared. 11 teeth were gone off the second wheel, 6 off the third. The fusee chain had whipped and scored the barrel. The calendar train, which Vehlin had cut to run a 400-year cycle, had jumped and mangled its own detent. The stack-freed cam, the modern one, the wrong one, was fine. It sat there gleaming, undamaged, having done exactly what a wrongly profiled cam does, which is survive. The syndicate sent a man named Halvard Quint. Quint was 59, a fine art adjuster out of Hertford by way of London, and he had the specific, unhurried courtesy of someone who has spent 30 years telling wealthy people bad news. He impounded the case. He took 900 photographs. He read the museum's conservation file and the transport authorization and the risk memorandum, and then he read a 4-page handwritten technical report with a diagram of a stack-freed cam that had been filed, stamped, and dated 11 days before the move. Then he sat in Garrick Ostrander's new gallery under the glass roof, with the dead clock behind him, and asked who Anselmo Trigo was. The Swiss said no. That is the part nobody expected, least of all Ostrander, who had spent the first week of the crisis on the phone in the tone of a man ordering a car brought around. The specialist in Neuchâtel came, spent 2 days with the case open and a borescope, and wrote a report of admirable honesty. Replacement crossbeat arms could be fabricated, yes, but the depthing of Vehlin's crossbeat gearing was not standard, was not published, and could not be measured off the wreck, because the parts you would measure from were the parts that had broken. Cut the arms wrong and you would have a $40 million object that ran for 9 months and then destroyed itself again. He recommended stabilization and display as a static artifact. He declined the commission. The house in Geneva declined. The workshop in Le Locle declined, politely, in 3 sentences. The British Museum's man wrote a long, kind letter that amounted to the same thing and included the sentence that finally broke something open, because Quint read it aloud in a board meeting on the 8th of January. The only complete dimensional record of a Vehlin crossbeat, the letter said, is understood to be in private hands in the United States. You should be speaking with Casimir Blount, who knows the history of that record better than anyone. Casimir Blount was 68, semi-retired, and had taught horological conservation at a school in Winstead for 22 years, after 11, at a house in Le Sentier. He came up to Marblehead in a brown tweed jacket with chalk in the pocket, looked into the open case for 40 minutes without saying anything, and then asked to be driven to Water Street in Kingsbridge. Fenn opened the shop for them, because Trigo did not answer his door for strangers. What Blount had come for was on the second shelf above the bench, where it had sat since 1982. 6 school notebooks with waxed covers, and a flat tin the size of a hardcover book. Trigo put them on the bench and opened the tin first. Inside, bedded in cotton, were 4 discs of dental plaster, each one bearing the cast profile of a stack-freed cam taken by wax squeeze from the sister clock in Terceira in July of 1979, before a hand touched it. He turned the notebooks around one at a time. 19 wheels, tooth counts, pinion leaves, arbor diameters to the half-thousandth in a small square hand, with cross-references to a page of crossbeat depthing measurements taken 11 ways, because a 24-year-old with no drawings and no supervisor had not known which measurement would turn out to matter, and had therefore taken all of them. Blount put his half-moon glasses down on the bench. His hands, Fenn noticed, were not entirely steady either. Fenn signed. Trigo went to the drawer under the window and came back with a manila envelope, and out of the envelope came 4 photographs, square, colour-shifted the way 1981 Kodak goes, of 2 hand-cut steel arms lying on a folded cloth next to a steel rule, and a letter, in Portuguese, on the letterhead of the Convento de São Gonçalo, dated the 5th of December 1981, thanking Senor Anselmo Trigo of Kingsbridge, Massachusetts, for 2 years and 5 months of work, and for the restoration of the chapter house clock to running condition. And one more photograph, taken by a monk with a borrowed camera, the inside of the clock's back door, and screwed to it a small brass plate bearing an anchor, the letters A.T., and the date 22x1 Jaraish 1981. Blount sat down on the customer's stool, which he had refused 4 times. He said, and then remembered himself and looked at Trigo instead of at Fen while she interpreted, "Not the notebooks, the rest of it. There are perhaps 6 people alive who have opened a Vehlin. 3 of us have opened the same one, in a museum, for a week, under supervision, with the parts in situ." He tapped the tin. "And you took the cam profile before you altered anything, which not one of us thought to do in 1998 or 2004 or 2011. Sir, the entire committee has spent a month establishing that the information required to save that clock does not exist. It exists." Trigo signed something. Fen hesitated, then rendered it exactly. The hearing was on the 21st of January, in the pavilion's rotunda, because the syndicate wanted it on the record and the pavilion's board wanted it in public, and because the pavilion's board had by then decided a number of things about Garrick Ostrander that they had previously found convenient not to decide. 40 folding chairs, both television crews, Naomi Okafor in the second row again. The vitrine at the back was empty, which somehow drew the eye more than the clock ever had. Quint chaired it, standing, in a grey suit, with a laptop and a stack of tabbed binders. Fen stood at the front and interpreted the whole 3 hours, and a second interpreter relieved her twice, and Trigo sat in the first chair on the aisle with his hands folded in his lap. Quint began with the transport authorization. It was 1 page. It authorized movement of the object in its display case, and beneath a checkbox reading "Movement let down prior to transport," there was the word "waived," and beneath that, initialed, was the reason, "schedule." Quint asked. "Mine," Ostrander said. A pause. Quint turned to the second tab. He read the 4-page technical report into the record, all of it, including the diagram, and had it entered as Exhibit C, and noted the date stamp of the Conservation Office, 11 days before the move. Then he opened the third tab and said that the museum's own press preview had been recorded by 2 networks and by the institution's media office, and that the relevant 90 seconds had been transcribed, and that he was going to play it. The rotunda's speakers were very good. They had been installed for the string quartet. "Sir, I'm going to be kind. Go home, fix something with a cuckoo in it. You cannot hear my clock. You have never touched my clock, and you are never going to." The laugh from the third row came through too. That was the part that did it. In a silent room in January, with the case empty behind him, the laugh sounded like something that had happened to a different species. Quint let it sit for 4 full seconds. Then he closed the laptop. "For the record," he said, "the syndicate has now obtained dimensional documentation of a Vehlin crossbeat escapement, including a pre-restoration cast of the stack-freed cam profile from a private archive in Kingsbridge, Massachusetts. 4 institutional workshops have declined this commission on the grounds that such documentation does not exist. It exists." He looked up. "The syndicate's finding is that the loss was avoidable, was specifically foreseen, and was not caused by the transport contractor. Coverage will be honoured under the conservation clause, and under that clause the syndicate names the restorer of record. There is one qualified restorer of record. Mr. Trigo, we would like to retain you." Nobody clapped, because it was not that kind of room. But Casimir Blount, standing at the back with his glasses pushed up on his forehead, said, "Ha!" once, loudly, into the marble. Philomena Drake, who had chaired the pavilion's board for 9 years and had signed the letter that welcomed the Ostrander loan, read a 2-paragraph finding of her own. The board acknowledged that a written warning from a qualified specialist had been disregarded. The board acknowledged that the exhibition catalogue had misattributed the São Gonçalo restoration and that a corrected provenance essay naming Anselmo Trigo would be issued and filed with the Portuguese Horological Society, the Getty's Provenance Index, and the two auction houses that maintain Vehlin records. Then Drake said the sentence that ended Garrick Ostrander's month, and she said it in the flat voice of a woman reading emotion. The consequences that followed were not dramatic, they were worse than dramatic, they were procedural. Ostrander was not ruined. Men like Ostrander are not ruined by a clock. What happened to him was that the collecting world, which is small and has an extremely long memory, read Naomi Okafor's piece in the Ledger and then the syndicate's finding, which was 3 pages, and quoted the 90 seconds in full. 2 Boston institutions quietly withdrew loan requests. A Zurich house that had been courting him for a spring consignment stopped returning calls. In March, the Ostrander Family Foundation's board, which included 2 cousins who had never liked him, voted to separate the chairmanship from the family name and installed a retired dean instead. In the same motion, on a recommendation that had come from Philomena Drake and had been drafted word for word by Halvard Quint, the foundation reinstated the Kingsbridge Community Annex grant with a 9-year commitment and no possibility of discretionary review. And in April, Garrick Ostrander drove himself to Water Street. He came up the narrow stairs in a coat that cost more than the building's roof, and he stood in the doorway of a shop 19 feet long, and he waited, because the bell was wired to a lamp, and the lamp took a second to catch. Trigo looked up from the bench. He did not stand. Ostrander had brought a piece of paper, and he had brought Fen, who had agreed to interpret on the single condition that she would render everything he said and nothing he did not. He read from the paper. His voice was not steady in the middle of it. He said he had been wrong in the rotunda in October and wrong in the rotunda in November. He said he had read a technical warning from a qualified man and had not seen a qualified man because he had already decided what he was looking at, and that the deciding had happened before the reading, which was the part he could not get out of his head. He said the catalogue was being corrected. He said he had authorized the waiver and had initialed it, and that the reason he had given was his own opening. Then he put the paper down and said the thing that was not on it. Trigo watched his mouth carefully. Then he signed, and Fen spoke it, and she did not soften a syllable. "I already took it from the syndicate 2 months ago." Ostrander nodded. Something in his face came apart very slightly and then reassembled. Trigo set down his tweezers. "You will sign the corrected provenance page yourself. Not your program director, your name under it." He worked from February to the middle of June in the pavilion's north workshop, under a skylight, with the case broken down into 1,100 inventoried parts on padded trays. Fen was assigned as conservator of record. 2 of his annex students came in as paid apprentices, both of them deaf, a 19-year-old named Perpetua Lund, who had the best eye for finishing he had ever taught, and a boy of 17 named Ithiel Marsh, who could not hold still for anything on earth except a lathe. Blount came up 1 week a month and mostly stood behind them saying nothing, which Blount understood to be the highest form of teaching. Trigo cut the crossbeat arms from the same alloy he had used in 1980 because he had written down which alloy and where he had bought it and what he had drawn the temper to, and the note in the margin said, "1980 stock too soft at Boss, go 2 points harder next time," which is a sentence written by a young man to an old man he had not met yet. He cut them over size, tempered them, cut them again. He recut 11 teeth into the second wheel and 6 into the third, each one hand-filed to a template lifted off the tooth counts in Notebook 3. He made a new great wheel arbor and left the original in the archive tray, sheared face and all, because you do not throw away the evidence of what happened. And he made the stack-freed cam over to the profile in the plaster, which meant the spring bore hardest at the barrel's strongest turn, the way Vehlin had intended in 1618, and the way nobody had understood in 2015. The last day was the 11th of June, and it took 9 hours, and at the end of it he closed the train and let the mainspring take one careful quarter turn and set the crossbeat swinging with the pad of his little finger. Then he did the thing his grandmother taught him. He took a 9-inch rod of brass, worn smooth in the middle from 47 years of handling, set the flat end against the back plate, and pressed the other end to his cheekbone just forward of his ear. Fenn stopped breathing. Lund and Marsh stood absolutely still. Blount took his glasses off. For 11 seconds, the old man's eyes were shut. Nobody in that room could have told you what he was receiving, because 4 of them could not hear anything at all, and the 5th could hear only a fast, dry ticking, and the thing Trigo was getting was not sound. It was 2 counter-swinging arms, arriving 1 hair apart, coming up through brass and bone into a place behind his eyes, unaveraged, unflattering, true. He opened his eyes. He turned the rod around and held it out to Perpetua Lund, handle first. "Feel it," he signed. "That is what right feels like." The Vehlin astronomical clock went back on public display in the Halloran Pavilion on the 9th of September, in a case with an unlocked back door, on permanent loan from the Commonwealth's Cultural Property Trust, which had acquired it from the Ostrander collection in a private transaction that nobody involved has ever discussed. The placard names the maker, the date, the 2 1981 and 2027 restorations, and the restorer. There is also a small brass witness plate on the inside of the back door. It has an anchor on it. The commission paid $1,400,000. Anselmo Trigo kept 40,000 of it, which was, by his arithmetic, 4 years of what a man needs on Water Street. The rest went into a building. He bought the old sail loft 2 doors down from the fish market, the one with the bad roof and the good north light, for $280,000, and he spent $600 on the roof and the floor and the wiring and 18 benches, and the Ostrander Family Foundation, whose new chairman is a retired dean with no patience for discretionary review, endowed the operating budget in perpetuity in a document that Garrick Ostrander signed personally on the same afternoon he signed a corrected provenance page. It opened in March with 14 students, and it is free. It will always be free. It takes deaf and hard-of-hearing kids between 15 and 22 from anywhere in New England, and it teaches them the bench, lathe work, wheel cutting, finishing, escapements, the whole cold, beautiful trade. And it places them, and 2 of the first 14 are now in Geneva. Perpetua Lund runs the finishing bench. Ithiel Marsh runs the lathes. Odalis Fenn is on the board. Casimir Blount comes 1 week a month and stands behind people saying nothing. It is called the Ilda Trigo School of Movement, and over the door, cut into a plank of oak by a 17-year-old who could not hold still for anything on earth, are 7 words in English and 6 in Portuguese. The hands hear what the ears lose. Anselmo Trigo was asked once by a reporter named Naomi Okafor whether the motto was about being deaf. He thought about it for a while. Then he signed that his grandmother had meant it as a technical instruction and that for 60 years he had understood it as a private consolation, and that he had been wrong both times. "A room where hands are taught to listen," he said, "is the only place the sentence is finished. Everything before that is just 1 pair of hands, and 1 pair of hands can always be walked out through a service door." Man, imagine being the guy who told the only man alive who could save his clock to go home and fix something with a cuckoo in it. Imagine that laugh in the 3rd row, and then imagine sitting in that same room in January with the case empty behind you. If that landed for you, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. And share it with somebody who's ever been talked past instead of talked to. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because we tell a lot of them. And before you go, tell me in the comments, who taught you the thing you're actually good at? I read every single one.